Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Meanwhile Here on Earth. This program features in-depth conversations with the leading names in the subjects of UFOs, abductees, the paranormal, panel discussions, and the very best and brightest of the next generation of writers and researchers. Meanwhile Here on Earth, the show breaking new ground in alternative talk with your intrepid host, veteran investigative writer and researcher, Peter Robbins.
It is Peter Robbins, and the show is Meanwhile Here on Earth. And welcome back, whether you're watching live on a Monday night or afternoon, or not alive at some point in the future. I'll hope for live, but you know. A brief word about a Facebook page that I came across last month. As we all know, the logarithms that govern our lives online will send us information that it thinks we might want to see. And in this case, it was yet one more notification of one more little Facebook group. And I thought, the name intrigues me. The librarianologist, a wonderful word that I had never heard before. And I clicked in to find out it had just begun. And it's a Facebook page where more and more people around the world who not just love reading and love books, but love the idea of building a personal library, come and post pictures of their bookshelves or their library room or that little corner they have where they read. And over the weeks that I've been visiting it and enjoying it very much as somebody who is one of those people who has spent years working on building a library since I was a kid, really. And the idea of having a personal library on books on subjects that you value or interest you. Here are all these book geeks from around the world, and I mean around the world, posting pictures and starting to tentatively communicate with each other. And other people remarking on their libraries, asking questions, and then seeing it's somebody in Pakistan talking to somebody in Finland, and somebody in Buenos Aires talking to somebody in New Delhi, asking about the kind of bookshelves they're using or what got them started on this subject. And I think with all of the madness and the destruction and the willful ignorance that so many people have on subjects that they could know more about if they wanted to, here is this wonderful cadre of people from all over the world just talking about books, not even talking about reading, which is understood that we all do, but their pride in building something substantial, a library. For those of you that have nothing better to do with your lives and tune in every week, you may see a slight difference in my bookshelves. If not, good, you're a sane, normal person. If you are seeing a difference, I pity you. You're like me and you are a total book geek. I am reorganizing my library to make it a bit more easy to use. And I thought, why not begin this episode on a somewhat positive note on a very overcast moment in human history where anything can happen and may well. But tonight we have a guest who I've been looking forward to having on the show, quite honestly, since we became friends online some years ago. Martin Powell has written hundreds of stories, both for comics and prose, and in numerous genres, for Disney, Marvel, DC, Dark Horse Comics, Capstone Books, and the Edgar Rice Burroughs Incorporated, among many others. Nominated for the prestigious Eisner Award for his fiction featuring Sherlock Holmes, he has written many of the most popular characters in the industry, including, are you ready for Superman, Batman, Popeye, Dracula, Frankenstein, and Tarzan of the Apes. Martin's Tall Tale of Paul Bunyan won the National Moonbeam Golden Award for Children's Graphic Novels of 2010, and he's pioneered the retelling of classic fairy tales with a freshly relevant 21st century spin for such critically acclaimed children's books as Little Red Riding Hood, The Ugly Duckling, Rapunzel, Frankenstein, and many more. Powell has written fan favorite science fiction comedy adventure, Mars Attacks Popeye. Can't beat that. And he is the creator of the Halloween Legion, a nominee for the Stan Lee Excelsior Award. He's also been an educational writer for Gander Publishing, dedicated to improving literacy, reading skills for students of all ages. Currently, Martin is author of nearly a dozen different Edgar Rice Burroughs weekly online comic strip series, and the critically acclaimed Jungle Tales of Tarzan graphic novel. In 2017, he received the coveted Golden Lion Award from the Burroughs Bibliophiles for his ongoing contributions to the legacy of Edgar Rice Burroughs. And Martin Powell, it is a pleasure to have you on the show tonight.
Well, my goodness, what an introduction. Well, I have to admit, when I first found out you were going to be doing this, I wanted to be on the show. We've had, as you know, both you and I, very, very busy schedules the last 3 or 4 years. But I'm
a couple of years.
Seriously. But thank you so much for inviting me. This is exciting for me to be here.
Well, it's my pleasure, and that's not just a figure of speech. Over the time that we have become friends on Facebook, and I obviously read your posts and see the photos you put up. I realize you're a kindred spirit in many respects, and I'm terribly curious about how, growing up as a kid who loved these entertainments in terms of novels that were presented to us often in a more simplified form as kids, and the classic comic book characters we grew up with. A lot of us went on to other things with our life. You stayed with it, and you made yourself a part of these worlds. And one of the threads I want to explore is the nature of creativity and how curiosity drives us to learn more and more about differing aspects of whatever that central subject was that set us off. And for you, like me, it's not only been in the world of movies and films, but very particularly in the world of actors who, can change our lives with a good performance and good writing and a good production. And I think the best place to begin is at the beginning. Where were you born?
I was born in Louisville, Kentucky. I lived, we weren't exactly in town, but you could see town, if you know what that means. Well, I'm sure you do. And until I was about 7, and then we moved to the suburbs, a place called Valley Station, about 30 miles out of Louisville. But what really happened to me, though, was where my cousins lived, about 30 miles south of that, which was a family farm at one time. And so I grew up there on weekends. Almost every weekend we went there. My dad had a twin brother, and his youngest son and I were like brothers. And so we spent every weekend together, practically every weekend, exploring the woods, walking through weird old fields, down old isolated country roads that led seemingly to nowhere but everywhere.
How wonderful.
And watched monster movies and things on Saturday nights.
Now, any siblings?
Yes, I have 2 older brothers. My brother Wayne is retired now. He was a chemical engineer. And my other brother, Rick, who just visited us a couple of weeks ago, is a retired school teacher. He was taught for 30 years.
As a little kid growing up, besides having this wonderful thread of rural life on your own terms and that feeling of adventure that's just built into taking off out the front door, and who knows what's going to happen and what you're going to see or do,
Really?
was the introduction of popular culture in terms of comic books, something that came to you through your brothers, or, there was a corner store that you'd occasionally go to, or specifically with comic books, where did it begin for you?
Sure. That started really with my brothers. They're quite a bit older than me, and so they already had a stack. I won't call it a collection. It was more of just stacks everywhere, through the house. But it was great stuff. It was things that you'd be familiar with. A lot of the old great DC comics that were so weird in the late 50s, early 60s, and then through most of the 60s.
My
like,
God, those
like
illustrations.
Metamorpho and the Doom Patrol and the Metal Men and things like that. Those interested me more than the mainstream heroes.
Yeah.
I like them too, but there was something about these oddball comics that really attracted me. It just seems like there were no rules, just anything goes, and they were especially a wonderful time. Those comics.
Was part of your child also, in the literary sense, caught up in reading Mad Magazine?
Oh yes, they had those too.
De-rigger.
From what I understand, although I don't remember it, Rick told me last time he was here that there was a little used bookshop just a few blocks away, and that they would. That's where they got most of their comics, and Mad Magazine was there too. And the comics they were used comics, of course. They cost only 3 cents a piece. So we had lots of them. I think probably the one that struck me the hardest when I was a kid, really made a big impression on me, was the Classics Illustrated version of Frankenstein.
The cover just came into my mind as you said it.
And I mean, it's wonderfully done.
Yeah.
And I was already a fan of the movies to a degree. I think I'd seen only 2. I think I think the first Frankenstein movie I ever saw that I can remember was Bride of Frankenstein, which is a great way to start. And then after that, Frankenstein meets the Wolfman. So I was familiar with the character, but here was a comic book about it that I didn't have to wait forever for it to show up on TV. I could open it anytime I wanted, which I think is part of the allure of comics for kids. It's right there, it's ready-made entertainment.
And with classic comics, because we have listeners and viewers who this is completely anathema to or alien to, this was a series of comics where the artists and the writers did a diligent job of digesting some major world-class novel and presenting it to you in comic book form, like 1% of the story, but moving along at a good clip, but often really thoughtfully done. And for many of us, it was, well, I will say it, a way of, I didn't read that novel for class assignment. I think I'll read the classic comics version and hope to God I can fake my way through this. But more to the point, it was, for some of us, our introduction to a lot of the world's great literature, which in some cases, some of us went on to actually read, in part because of this introduction. And here's where several things come together. There is this classic novel by Mary Shelley called Frankenstein. It's published in the early 19th century. And what began in Hollywood with the great 1931, I think, James Whale film of Frankenstein, which introduced the world to Karloff. And then the more comedic spin-offs of it. When you were in elementary school, let's take it back to there, and you understood that children grow up, and when you grow up, you're supposed to do something like adults do, for lack of a more descriptive term, get a job or work on a farm or work in the office or do something, but rarely did it include the things that you really wanted to do, like, say, read comics and do drawings. Did you have an idea that you were pushing with yourself as a child of what you might end up doing, possibly besides being a soldier, a fireman, or a police officer, if you had my basic instincts there, as a child that you thought you might end up doing as a grown-up? Other than what you're doing.
Um, well, I don't know that I thought about it that much necessarily. The adults around me generally, aside from my parents, which were great, seemed to be pretty miserable people. So I knew that
Oh.
something must be making them pretty miserable. But I don't know. I think I don't think I remember ever thinking one day I'll be writing comic books. Which, I mean, I write prose as well, but that's mostly what I'm known for.
Yeah.
That and my children's books. So I think I viewed comics just a slight step down from movies, and they seem very glamorous to me. And I mean, especially when you dealt with characters like Superman and Batman that everyone in the world knew. You know, that was kind of intimidating, and I don't think
Yes.
I ever thought I would be worthy, to do something like that. I did think about writing prose a lot, and I wrote poetry of a sort after a fashion. And but what I was really starting to get interested in was dinosaurs, which kids today are rather, I mean, good for them, but they're rather spoiled with them. When I was a kid, it was rare to come across like a dinosaur toy or a dinosaur book, even, especially one that you could understand as a kid.
Yeah.
So that started interesting me a lot more than it did my friends, who all liked them too, but there was something about them that I wanted to know more about, constantly. And I've always been a big animal lover, and I think the attraction to dinosaurs was there were these magnificent creatures that I will never see alive, and so it made me want to know more about them. I figured the more I learned about them, the more I could see them in my head and maybe imagine what they were really like. So actually, my formal education, once I started going to college, was in paleontology.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah. So I remember being at Big Bone Lick, Kentucky, the national park. What a strange name for a national park, named by Thomas Jefferson, and who was a fossil collector as well. And one of the first field trips that we had in class, we were walking around looking for stuff. And the rule they had then, I think this has changed, used to be if you could pick it up, if you could dig it up, pick it up and carry it out by yourself, you could have it.
Right.
So,
Maybe not so much now.
No, I don't think so now.
You found something?
I literally tripped over something that I thought was a log at first. And then I looked at it and I thought, well, that's rock. Then I thought, well, is it petrified wood? And then I figured out, still erroneously, that it was a portion of a mammoth tusk. What? Oh, about, so much, so big, not very big. Partially.
But that moment of realization.
So I dug it up and we took it back to class. I didn't get to keep it. It wasn't quite mineralized completely, so it was kind of starting to decay.
Interesting.
Smelling very much like a tooth, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And then later on, one of the instructors there at the college came by and correctly identified it as an American mastodon tusk.
Wow.
So
and you
so
found
that was my one significant find, So I wrote a paper on it, and I had hoped that more would come of it, but then I started writing, and just for my own recreation, if nothing else, to get away a little bit from academia.
What did you start with, as far as fictional?
I wrote a dinosaur story called The Dinosaur Doctor. That involved, this was, mind you, about 9 years before Jurassic Park, the book. It involved a scientist who was taking dinosaur blood from flies that had been trapped in amber, using their DNA to make dinosaurs.
Oh boy.
Yeah. And
there's
years later, of course, several friends of mine were like, "Man, you need to sue that." I'm like, it's not really an original idea. I'm sure lots of people had the idea when it was an article that I read. I think it was in Time Magazine or Newsweek that suggested that such a thing might be possible. And so I just ran with that. And Crichton, for all I know, might have seen the same article, but he certainly wrote a better story than I did. And I'm no way I'm going to tell Stephen Spielberg rather. No, you can't do that. That's based on my story, which it wasn't.
I'm sure your team of lawyers was ready to go.
Such as it was.
Backtrack for a moment because for me, my love of dinosaurs began, I think, probably before I could really remember, because one of the great gifts I had growing up, coming of age in a small village about 30 miles east of my hometown, New York City, was regular trips to the Museum of Natural History, starting well before I was school age with my grandfather. And he opened the world for me in quite a number of ways. But, from the time of earliest memory, 4 or 5 years old, as far as that goes, going to the Museum of Natural History and seeing these huge reassembled dinosaur skeletons and learning about fossils and that wonder when you finally are able to grasp that sophisticated concept that organic material deteriorates and it fills with other material that becomes a casting, and then it's, oh my God, it is what it is. And it's, a number old that you can't even, 100 years old is pretty old when you're 5, but 100 million, this is intriguing.
Yeah, and you can't really perceive it.
Coming back from the museum and give me some paper and pencil or crayons, I need to go to work. Sometimes from memory, sometimes from the postcards I would get there, but that love of dinosaurs. And to jump ahead a moment, for somebody with the depth of appreciation and fascination and wonder about these creatures, to see Jurassic Park for the first time, that had to be more than a normal movie experience for you.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, it was. The whole sequence with the Tyrannosaurus Rex. By the way, I hate the term T-Rex. It's a dumbed down term, and I don't like it. I mean, you have a magnificent name like Tyrannosaurus. And
that's a very thank you.
I mean, So anyway, that's a little problem I have. But yeah, that scene where that's in the rain where it first gets loose. Rexy, I think, is what they call that dinosaur. It was. It was just mind-boggling to me. It looks so real.
Yeah.
And I had seen and loved the dinosaurs, like in the original King Kong and Ray Harryhausen's dinosaurs that he has in several of his movies. I love those too. But this, though,
it's a different reality and the appreciation of, non-CGI. My experience also, again, not professionally, but just this thread of affection and fascination for these creatures. I saw it at the Ziegfeld Theater in Manhattan, which is certainly at the time the widest screen and the finest sound system, possibly in the States, but certainly back then in New York City. And it was that sequence where I think it's the Triceratops that's not well, is being nursed by Sam Neill and Laura Dern. And all of a sudden, the John Williams score swells and the camera pans up, and there are the brontosauruses. And I remember, and I think you can appreciate this, it lasted less than a second, but it was very real. It was a moment of, and I'm a sophisticated viewer, of, oh my God, holy shit. The secret of this film is not that the technology has finally been able to realize this vision. They found the island. They found the island where oh no. And then that very wistful feelings of, no, they didn't find the island. But one thing you can be sure of is you can never trust another image that you see on screen in your life because they've got it down. Now, love of movies is something, and love of acting and performers and great storytelling is something that has been central to my life and yours since we were kids, and I expect will be right until we go into whatever happens next after this life. Was did you see your first movies on television, as far as ones that impacted on you like this, or did your folks or your brothers take you to a local movie theater to see some of these films that stayed with you and helped form you?
On TV primarily, and we had, probably like you did, a black and white set that, with the reception not so great sometimes.
Maybe four channels if you're lucky.
Yeah, depended on the weather, even if things like that. It was as a kid you would pray, oh please, please, please don't let it rain this Sunday so I can watch Wizard of Oz. So which if you missed it, you just missed it. It wouldn't be back for another year or so.
Yeah, not on demand.
No. So yeah, it started on TV, and the first movie I ever saw in a theater was with a Head Start class I had, so I must have been 5 or 6, and it was Disney's Cinderella. And not only was it the first movie I saw in a theater, it was the first color movie I ever saw.
Oh my gosh!
So I was just, I think I was speechless coming out of it. And a lot of the other kids in my class, they seemed to be entertained by it, but I could tell as they were coming out, they had already forgotten it, but not me. I was kind of like, what? But how did they, it looks so different than the cartoons on TV. Aside from just the color, there was a lot of the figure seemed so alive. The animation was different.
Oh my gosh!
And then the first like live action movie that I ever saw, and this I'm grateful for this as well, was at the drive-in. Very rare instance where my dad took us to see the Beatles movie Help.
Oh,
yeah, which was also in color, and I already loved the Beatles at that age, so it was a big deal to me too.
Very wonderful. I wanted to ask you, do you remember about how old you were when you saw The Bride of Frankenstein?
Probably about 5, maybe.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Like vague memory of being in the living room, probably one television in the house, as we all had, and the family watching together, or not really remembering anything except being there with the story?
Our house, this is when we lived still close to in town, was so small that our living room was basically our dining room kitchen. So we had a couch in the kitchen, and the TV was in there too. And so I remember sitting on the kitchen floor, watching, cross-legged on the kitchen floor, watching this movie and enthralled by it. But I wonder about that, because one of the things that is probably been the most prominently inspiring and influential thing in my life has been those films, the Universal monsters in particular.
Yes.
And I was thinking this the other day, of trying to remember exactly how that started and why. Like, why was I watching? I'm pretty sure that was the first movie, but maybe not. It might have been another one that I've just forgotten over the years. But
a question for you that's central in a lot of our lives, for those of us that love films, love being entertained, and I like a good classic scary movie. I'm not into slasher movies or lots of gratuitous violence, unless the violence is not gratuitous and it's integral to the story, etc. But that feeling of understanding as a kid that there's being scared and there's being fun scared. Mm-hmm. And it's a big difference, and it's actually it can be a revelation. This is fun, and it's kind of scary, even though I'm putting it together. I remember for me, one of the things was, Mom, Dad, is that actor still alive? It's that point where you realize that some people are dead and some people are alive, and then a little beyond that sooner or later all people that are alive are going to be dead. And then you start to talk to God about, can I find a way around this kind of, this is not making me happy. But the idea of, again, I'm entertained. I'm excited. This is scary, but this is fun, as opposed to real fear, which we all understand. Do you remember a moment watching those early Universal films where you appreciated that, or where something reminded you of it?
Sure. I think that for me, in Bride of Frankenstein in particular, was Karloff's performance.
Mm.
As a kid, I had to wear a brace for a while on my ankle, and so I had a I wore corrective shoes or very heavy, and so I had
Oh,
kind of an awkward walk. Couldn't really
sure.
do the sports thing like a lot of other kids. And I saw something in him I recognized, you
Oh,
know, and I think that's one of the things that pulled me in. He's basically a 5-year-old kid. I mean, he's inarticulate, he's clumsy, he's awkward, you know, a, a bit odd looking, which is probably moving more into adolescence. But I think that's what I was attracted to, is I knew
mm,
this guy, and I understood how he felt when the villagers were chasing him,
mm.
especially when he didn't do anything wrong, just because he was different, and I was teased and bullied enough, just like every other kid was, to understand what that felt like, and to see that portrayed so beautifully on the film, where you really felt for him, as horrible as he looked, especially back in those days. you
Yes,
know the makeup was much more startling than it is today.
sensational.
um,
And
but yeah, that's what I think that's why that particular movie pulled me in, for that reason. And I told Karloff's daughter the same thing when we met, and she seemed to especially appreciate that he had an impression, made such an impression on a little kid, because he loved kids. I do remember too, he was the first movie star that I remember knowing his name,
ah,
basically.
ah,
Although my brother said that I pronounced it more like Boris Karloff, you know. But uh,
close enough.
but I would see him in different things after that, and I always would recognize him, even if it
Yes.
wasn't a horror movie. And then I remember seeing an episode, I think it was a rerun of the Red Skelton show, where he was a guest on it, and he was an old man. And I remember asking my mom about that, and starting to realize that the movies I was watching, because the TV was black and white for
Yes.
everything, so
Yes.
the movies I was watching were old. I didn't really know that at first, and then I started. Unlike a lot of people today that won't watch an old movie like made 7 years ago, um, that actually enthralled me, because I thought, well, there was something in me that made me feel like, well, the old stuff would be the best stuff, right? Because
Yeah.
everything else would be copied off of it. And so that's just kind of the way I felt. And so this is like the original ideas, so I sought those out, and I still do. There's amazing things in film that people um, are they're selling themselves short by not looking into it, especially some of the silent movies, which hardly anybody
Oh
wants to
my
watch
gosh.
these days.
I couldn't agree
But
with you more. I think that's one of the tragedies of our time. And of course, with the advent of more and more technical ways to augment and perfect the visual image, we're all sophisticated viewers now. All you need is, well, you can even find stuff on YouTube, but if you have either Amazon Prime or Netflix or any of 100 other plus, you're used to seeing well made. But the idea that it all began somewhere, uh, and these guys were making it up as they went along, is terribly exciting to me, and still is. There's a moment in, this is years ago, but you may remember it, in the Robert Downey Jr. biopic of Chaplin, which he got his Academy Award nomination for. And he was wonderful in it, as was everybody,
yes,
I think, to a great degree.
it's a great
We're
movie.
brought into a scene where it's a Charlie Chaplin movie being made, and it's black and white. And you see the Max Sennett character played by Dan Aykroyd giving directions, and it morphs and it becomes color. And in that moment, I remember thinking something I'd thought countless times before: these were living, breathing people.
Mhm.
Right at that moment, they might have been wondering what they were going to be having for lunch. if things were going to work out with the person they were attracted to right now, if, and it was really quite a wonder. I still watch silent movies to a degree in that spirit of, these are working actors and often winging it as they went and being asked to make things up. Going back again, there are characters now, iconic characters in the world of children's literature, who are considered understandably dated or, past due, or from a charming different piece of time. But a great story is a great story, and great characters are great characters. The Edgar Rice Burroughs series of Tarzan of the Apes, Tarzan the Ape Man, is well over 100 years old and entertained our grandparents, in some cases our great grandparents. And yet, as a franchise, as a ongoing living thing that keeps giving us new stories, what do you remember introducing you originally to Tarzan? For me, I think it was like a beat up old, Tarzan series book from a book sale of just, wow, this is a beat up old book and the writing is so arcane, but there's something about it that's kind of charming and exciting. And that whole notion of, the white guy in the jungle trying to figure it out and, living their life after the plane has crashed. And do you remember your introduction to Tarzan?
No, I don't actually. It feels like he was always in my life. It's just like my cousin I told you about in the country. I don't remember meeting him. He was always with me. It was like that way with Tarzan. I knew him mostly from Saturday afternoon movies, the Johnny Weissmuller Tarzans.
That's right.
Which I loved, which aren't a whole lot like the character of the books, really, though. I didn't know that then. Still love the movies, though. And eventually, what had happened, as I recall, I was in a drugstore somewhere, and there was a copy of Tarzan the Terrible on a spinner rack. It had Triceratops on it. So I thought, wow, Tarzan book, because the Tarzan books kind of went in and out of print many different times over the last several decades. And some people just, when they were that age for Tarzan, it just wasn't there. And then a couple of years later, they'd start showing up again, in new printings.
And there's so much competition.
Right. I was lucky in regard to that was the series was starting to be reprinted again. And so I took it home and read it and thought, wow, this is really a lot cooler than the movies. And it made me seek out the other books, which I have a sizable collection today, including a lot of the originals. So
how wonderful. Yes, I've seen some of those on your shelves. That's a pretty breathtaking collection. A character that has informed my life in a number of ways, but is purely fictional, was introduced to me in a very roundabout way. I'm talking here about Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson, which date back to the 19th century and the great writings of Arthur Conan Doyle, whose detective is world famous and world renowned. And my introduction was not through any of the books or treatments of them, but like so many young people, through the black and white movies with the great Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce playing those two iconic roles. And it was my little Russian grandmother who introduced me to so many wonderful aspects of popular culture now that I think back on it, watching those movies with her. And the earliest ones date from the later 30s, although they certainly run into the 40s. And even as a kid, I was aware, I had some sense of history, and that, gee, he's here fighting the Nazis now, and that's great. But 1880s, he's looking pretty good for 110. That kind of, magical thinking. What was your introduction? And I should then say, I became so enamored with the character that I actually started to get and read the books, and then, study the nuances and the books about the character, and then about Conan Doyle himself and his times in his life, which is an added benefit of just that, that happy curiosity that accompanies some of our explorations into fictional literature. What was your introduction to the Holmes character?
Well, Conan Doyle was an amazing man. He's a remarkable man, not simply just for being an author, but when my Scarlet and Gaslight first came out, I think it was in 1987, I think, I got to talk to his daughter. They were working out a licensing thing with, with the estate, and to make the book more authorized, and official. And that was wonderful talking to her.
Oh,
And she, one of the things she told me that I particularly found very interesting was that she remembered when Harry Houdini used to visit them. And for a while, Conan Doyle and Houdini were good friends.
yes.
And they never really lost respect for each other, but their friendship fell out because they had different belief systems.
Part of it had to do with life after death, as I recall.
It had, yes, it did. And with a focus on the mediums that were claiming to be able to speak with with the dead and so forth. And
Right.
and Houdini hoped that was true, but he kept finding out when he would investigate himself that everything was fake.
Yep.
And that he could do it too. And he figured, well, just because I can fake it doesn't mean necessarily they are, though. So he had a very open mind toward
Yes, he did.
it. But Conan Doyle, his wife was a trance medium,
Yeah.
and he was very determined that this was real. And he was always so adamant about it. He would say things like, I'm not talking about something I believe. I'm talking about something I know, things that I've seen and felt and handled, and things like this. He seemed so gung ho about it, and he was such a brilliant man that I think maybe he might have been onto something too. The answer to something like that is a lot more complicated than we ever think it's going to be, I believe. But how I discovered Holmes was, I think it was in the 4th grade, and it was in class, reading class. We had the textbook we had was full of short stories by various authors.
Good.
And this one was it was The Norwood Builder by Conan Doyle, which has a particularly clever ending. I thought. I won't say what it is in case someone hasn't read it, but it's something that really appealed to me. And the way the teacher, who was a nun, by the way, introduced him was interesting. She said, "Now this is a book, a story about a detective named Sherlock Holmes." And some people giggled. She said, "Yes, Sherlock's a very strange name. We don't hear that much, but it used to be a fairly common name," she said. And then she said, "Well, this is a detective who's so smart that he can just take a look at you and study you for a moment, and he knows everything you've done that day and everything that you probably will do tomorrow."
Whoa.
And she said, "It's
That's
not
a
some kind
rave.
of," yeah, she said, "it's not some kind of supernatural power. He's just that smart."
I love it.
And that really attracted me. I thought, wow, can you do that? And of course, Conan Doyle made it seem very realistic in
Yes,
all
he
of his
did.
stories that Holmes could do this.
Yes.
Apparently, he had a surgeon instructor when he was a student named Joseph Bell, who actually could do this. Someone would walk into his office, and he could just take a glance at them and know what their profession was, know if they were married, how many kids they had, just without saying a word. And so that stuck with him over that. But that's what got me into Holmes. And then I think I started seeing the movies on TV. I believe Hound of the Baskervilles was first, which is interesting because I've adapted that book twice. Once as a graphic novel for grown-ups, although there's certainly nothing wrong in it the kids couldn't like.
Sure.
And then another one directed specifically at kids. And so they're the same book, but done in a different way. So I knew the story well enough that I didn't have to crack the book open to write them.
Yeah. The fan base for Sherlock Holmes, like a number of legendary literary characters, is extraordinary.
It is.
A century ago, you might have called him an influencer. And there are Sherlock Holmes clubs and book clubs and, fraternal organizations and groups all over the world. And of course, in London at 221 on the second floor, 221B Baker Street in London, Holmes lovers have created the fictional digs of this character. One of those wonderful moments in literary history where the people that love the characters to such a degree manifest them and aspects of them in real life. And there are silent Sherlock Holmes films. Of course, in more modern times, we have the great Jeremy Brett playing Holmes wonderfully to Hardwick.
Edward
Hardwick as his second in command.
Those are my favorites, by the way.
Oh, I think that no question about it. He had it down to the literary core, that zeitgeist, that feeling of the real character, although for pure entertainment purposes and nostalgia as well. Nigel, Bruce, and Basil Rathbone are in a class by themselves.
Oh yeah, they are. I love those too. And I remember reading somewhere that Jeremy Brett also was a big fan of Basil Rathbone.
That's good to hear. That's good to hear.
When he was first approached to play Sherlock Holmes, he turned it down because he felt he was all wrong for it. And it was mainly because he was intimidated by Basil Rathbone and Peter Cushing.
It's an offhand compliment, to be sure.
Yeah, so they somehow or another, somebody talked him into it. Thank goodness they did. There's a lot of good Sherlock Holmes actors, but for me, the thing that makes him stand out is he portrayed Holmes in a human light.
Yes.
That the others don't so much.
They're
fine. It's fine, but there's something about him. He seems like a real guy, which makes his mental prowess that much more impressive.
I think all brilliant performances, that wonderful PBS series. Karloff being the first actor that you recognized and knew by name and started to get a sense of as a human being in the universe that played parts, was joined, I'm sure, not long after by other great actors who were playing roles in films with characters that you were entertained by and watching. Lon Chaney Jr., my gosh, Vincent Price, Peter Lorre, the whole pantheon that comes with them. Do you remember starting to collect those personalities in your mind and have a sense that these were people also doing something quite wonderful with their lives, not writing, but bringing the characters to life? Was there a moment like that for you? I'm just interested in your creative process.
Sure. I think that what I'd figured out was that this was all connected somehow. That it was I didn't know what the word genre meant then or anything, but that's what I was seeing. I was seeing this something being created in front of my very eyes. Bela Lugosi was a big impression of me too, but I think that what really kind of drew it all together for me was Famous Monsters of Filmland magazine. Because when I first saw that, I didn't know it existed, for one thing. There it was on the newsstand. There was this lurid picture of Mr. Hyde on the cover, it was great. And my mom bought it for me. I think it was 35 cents. So that was a big deal, it wasn't a 12-cent comic book.
No.
And I took it home and looked through it. And I saw that there was a little number at the top corner. So I thought, there must be more, not just this one. And started looking through it, all the pictures, and I was just completely just overwhelmed. And there's letter columns of other kids like me that was into this. And that is what did it for me, because I thought there's other people that like this too, because I thought I was the only one. Yeah. So that's what really made me realize, well, it is a kind of niche thing, it's a little bit on the fringe of regular cinema and so forth, but because I like movies of all kinds, but that kind of thing, I met the only one of these guys I ever got a chance to meet was Vincent Price.
Oh,
And I met him accidentally, really. I had a little experience in the theater years ago. I was in Chicago doing as part of a very, very poor Shakespeare company in a very poor theater, whereas Vincent Price was there doing a really good play in a really fine theater with Roddy McDowell was the Charlie's aunt. But I didn't know that at the time.
huh.
And I came out as after we were all done for the night, exhausted as that kind of thing makes you. And I looked underneath a street lamp. There's a fellow there waiting for a cab,
No.
trying to hail a cab. And I looked at him and I thought, oh my God, that's Vincent Price. And I remember blinking several times, thinking, "Is my eyes playing? Why would Vincent Price be on this street corner, at this particular time of night?" And so I thought, well, am I going to do it? So I said, I walked up to him. And he seemed about 9 feet tall, and gave me a bone-crushing handshake. And he was extremely, I got to say, he was extremely approachable. He was just a very gracious fellow, funny, and we talked together for about 15 minutes or so. He even passed up a couple cabs while we were talking.
Wow, class act.
It was and later on he sent me a picture, autograph
Famous
picture.
Monsters magazine was in a class by itself, and its founder was in a class by himself.
Mhm.
Furry at one point had the largest collection of science fiction horror movie props in the world.
He
And
did.
he mentored so many young people, mostly boys, but not exclusively. Paul Davids tells the story of winning the Famous Monsters contest and being brought out to Los Angeles
I
and
remember
spending the
that.
week with him, and changed his life. And I was lucky enough to be in Los Angeles, this is years ago, as Paul's guest. And what is his whole name, the founder again?
Forrest Jackerman.
Forrest J. Ackerman.
Mhm.
It was his 89th birthday, and Paul had
Wow.
been invited and got me an invitation. And it was magic time, as you might imagine, Martin. It was at a big kind of Chinese, well, sort of an Asian restaurant in not a great part of Los Angeles with well over 100 people. And as my eyes and my sensibilities started to adjust, I realized, wait, she was the co-star in This Island Earth. And a lot of actors from the 50s and 60s, and just people that loved this man. He really was one of the most magnetic, quietly joyous people I have ever met. Talk about doing what you want to do, doing what you're meant to do. A truly remarkable character. At a certain point, and we're coming into the end of our first hour here, you said to yourself, I think I could write well enough to have a shot at maybe selling, a script or an article. And what was that moment? What was that piece that you first got out there, got sold, and all of a sudden we're in another chapter of your life?
Right. Well, it was when I was in college, still studying paleontology and a few other things. I was writing on an old portable typewriter, which took a little muscle, to type on in those days. And I'd written several stories, just for me, more or less. It seemed like to me the important thing was to get it done,
Yeah.
just to whatever. And then fortune smiled on me, I guess I should say. It's something that Forey used to say a lot. And I was at a book signing by Ray Bradbury, and so I got to meet him, and we talked briefly. That was the great thing about Ray. I noticed he did this with everyone that came up to him. He wouldn't just sign a book and hand it back to you. He would make a comment at you like, "Oh, I like that shirt," or you look like my cousin or something like that. And then he would end up talking to everybody about, 5 or 6 minutes or so,
I love it.
Which
It
seemed
takes
like
longer for the line to move, but who cares?
Yeah. And so that happened. And he, for some peculiar reason that I never really asked him, I regret that I didn't, he gave me his business card. I didn't see him give it to anybody else. He may have. It had his phone number on it.
Oh my gosh.
And so a few weeks later, I called him up and he answered right away. And I remember thinking, wow, he answers his own phone, and we talked for a while. He remembered me. And we just talked about a few things and found out that we had a whole lot in common.
Oh my gosh, Martin.
Yeah, King Kong was about to come on TV again. And I was telling him about that. He goes, oh, well, you can't talk to me and Miss King Kong, stuff like that. And so we just kind of chatted. And this went on for a few months. And then one time he called me up and said,
Actually, hold that thought. We're going to find out what he said when he called you up. And this is Peter Robbins, my very special guest, Martin Powell. We will return in a few short minutes. Stay with us. And we are back with Meanwhile Here on Earth. My special guest, Martin Powell, was about to tell us about a phone call with Ray Bradbury. And I have to say here, in making that phone call initially to call him, or in making a decision to step forward and approach a public person in a public place, those of us that are fans, walk that line of, am I going to be intrusive, obnoxious, and inappropriate, getting this person when they're vulnerable and, they have got to live with jerks like me, or I have a sense, or I'm telling myself I have a sense that they might be open to being approached and affable and understand that their fans are why they are who they are. But you did it. And it was, in this phone call, you made a real contact with him. He called you, you say, in this?
A couple of times he did. It was usually me. And during one of the conversations, just out of the blue, he said, we were getting ready to hang up. And he said, before I forget, he goes, send me one of your stories. And I had not told him that I was writing stories. And I said, how did you know I was writing stories? He said, oh, come on. He said, just send me one of your stories. And I said, well, they're not very good. He said, well, send me the one that's the least not good. So out of 10 or so that I had handy, I sent him the one that I thought
was the least not good.
Was okay. And I sent it to him, and but he kept it for a few days, and then did call me back, and he said, "Oh," and we chatted casually for a few minutes, and then he suddenly, and I could tell he knew I was wanting to know what he thought. He was kind of playing with me.
This is Ray Bradbury.
Yeah, and he said, "Oh, I got your story." I said, "Oh yeah." He said, "Yeah. It's not very good, is it?" And I kind of knew it wasn't very good, but I remember that just made me, I was crestfallen, but only for a second. And then he said, "Now don't get me wrong." He said, "Don't get me wrong. Don't get depressed or anything." He said, "It starts well, but it's too long." He said, "All stories are too long. My stories are too long." He said, "I had to cut 20,000 words out of Something Wicked This Way Comes." He goes, "Because they said it was too long." I heard a little resentment in his voice there. And he said, "But," he goes, "but I can see that you've got it. You've got it there." He said, "I can see it on the page." And he said, "I'm going to tell you something that's not going to make any sense. It's going to make all the difference to you one day. But it's not going to make any sense right now." I said, "Okay." I was, wow, a great secret from Ray Bradbury on how to write,
Yeah.
And then he said, "Okay, are you listening?" "Yes." "Start as close to the end as you possibly can." And he said, "That's it." And I went, "Okay." And he said, "You think I'm nuts?" He said, "But," he said, "what's going to happen is after you write about 1,000,000 words," he said, "something's going to change the wiring in your brain, and you're going to understand what I mean. And it's going to be something that you can't really even explain to someone else, but you'll know how to do it."
Fascinating.
And that's exactly what happened. About 5 years later, after that, suddenly I remember I was in the middle of finishing up some story, and it felt different when I was done somehow. And it wasn't a particularly great story, but it still was, I guess, of the most professional quality that I'd had at that time. I wrote it as a lesson in one of my writing classes, and the teacher flunked me on it because the instructions were to write a story that was composed of nothing but dialogue.
Oh my.
And
Nothing but dialogue.
Right. And so I had a fellow at his dead wife's grave talking to her. Then I realized, well, he said dialogue, not monologue. So I had to have her talk back.
That's the way it works.
And that was kind of the story. It had a kind of EC Comics kind of twist, although I didn't know about them in those days. And not my greatest hour, but I thought it was fun. Well, he flunked me on it because he told me it was totally unrealistic and that all my stories were the same. So I said, okay. By the way, this was a professor who was working on his novel for 20 years. Yeah.
I'll say nothing about that.
Wonder if he ever finished it. Probably not. So what I did is I was corresponding with a friend in Ireland at the time, and I sent her the story along with my letter and things. We used to exchange a lot of different artwork and things like that. She was an artist herself. And I didn't say anything about it, except I just said, teacher flunked me on this. It's not that bad, is it? And that's all I said. And she never responded about it again. And then about almost a year later, probably about 9-10 months, I got an envelope in the newspaper, an envelope in the mailbox along with the newspaper and everything else. It just kind of bundled up. I almost missed it. And it was from Australia. And I thought, who do I know in Australia? Nobody. And so I opened it up, and there's this very lurid magazine called Fantastique. that apparently was a very notorious horror magazine in Australia that was banned actually within a few months.
Wow.
So still, I'm like, who sent me this? So I opened it up, and a check fell out of it. And I looked, and it was $200, and it may as well have been 2 million, the way I felt.
You're a pro.
And I looked at the table of contents, and there was my name. And my friend had sent that story to them. She had worked.
You
for
had
them,
no
apparently.
idea it was submitted.
No, and she had illustrated parts of it, and they published it. So that seemed to make all the difference somehow. It was like not long after that, within weeks, I sold something else to someone else. I never approached them again. And I sent them a letter thanking them, but it was really the magazine was kind of bad taste, honestly. But so it goes. But so that's what got me started.
Published writer.
Yeah, that's what got me started.
There is something about being given advice, good advice, by a world famous writer that for somebody who has a dream is emblematic that almost anything can happen. This guy talked to me. Years ago, when I taught art in a wonderful private school in Brooklyn Heights, one of my students was the son of the woman who went on to become Norman Mailer's last wife. And he's a good kid, and I really liked working with him. It's a big adjustment time for him, too. And I got quite close to the family for a period of time. And Norman, at one point, was kind enough to review some early chapters in the book that went on to become Left at East Gate about the British UFO incident, and was kind enough to give me some feedback, also saying, I can't do this again, in that so many people give me material they'd like me to read, or my advice or blurb, and I will always start to read something, even if it's a few pages, because if I run into that person, I can look them in the eye and I can say, I'm reading what you sent me. And then his advice, though, which I kind of bowled me over, and it was a little intimidating, but it has served me since, is when you're writing and you're on a roll and you've got that, you've already created the sentence that you're going to end the paragraph with, and it's a great sentence, and you're building to it, and your whole mind process is, what words do I need to throw in front of it to get the full effect of this last sentence? It was, as you're writing, keep putting your best material, your best sentence, your best thought, your best phrase first. And my reaction was, no, not that sentence, because I'm saving. No, that's the sentence you want to start the paragraph with. You'll figure it out. Of course, immediately I felt the rug pulled out from me, and over the intervening time, the rug has been snugly put back into place. It's just a different philosophy of writing. Some of the characters that you have gone on to become one of that handful of writers that has been allowed legally and in terms of the publishers and the estates of the authors to write in the mode of, as you noticed at the top of the show, noted, these are iconic world-class characters. We're talking about not just Tarzan and Sherlock Holmes, but Superman and Batman and the holy of holies of, the world of comic fiction. I remember at one point seeing a book that had been approved by the estate of Mario Puzo in the Godfather series, and thinking, I guess you got to be pretty good for those folks to say, okay, you can write the next one, don't mess it up. A little extra stimulation there. But at some point, did you approach, or were you approached by the estates or the organizations or the publishers or the keep people involved in one of these character story developments to write that story, as opposed to just give us, we're interested in what you're doing, write a horror story or a fiction story for us, and we'll see if we can use it. That's a big jump. How did that happen?
It's really strange. The only thing that I can remember that I ever really sought myself, like that I wanted to get published, was Scarlet and Gaslight, which is a Sherlock Holmes Dracula story. And it had already been done twice before by different writers whom I admire, but I didn't really like what they had done, because I didn't think that they made, for one thing, they made Sherlock Holmes instantly like this fearless vampire hunter. And I didn't think that was very realistic to Sherlock Holmes. He didn't believe in the supernatural. But what if he was face to face with it one day? How would he react? And I decided he would have a nervous breakdown. And that was basically the idea of the story, in a nutshell. And so I tried for about 3 years, I think. I sent it to every comic publisher I could think of, including one that was doing Sherlock Holmes stories. And nobody wanted it. And
is that an open copyright now? That fairly last year's that anybody can write a Holmes story now? I think it's a 75-year or whatever it was. But now it's okay, got it. Continue on.
Back when I was doing it, it was iffy as far as the copyright was concerned. Some people were doing it and not caring. Others were going through the estate. Sometimes the estate would send cease and desist letters to some writers, and others they would ignore it. It was a complicated thing. But finally, I sent it to. Back up. What had happened is I'd become friends with a comic book artist in New York City, Dean Haspiel, who's won Emmys and so forth now, and great guy. And we came up with a character called The Verdict that we created together. That was a very kind of comic book film noir style mystery kind of character. And we did the first few pages of that story. I wrote and he drew, sent it off to a publisher that he knew in New York, and they liked it, but they weren't for sure that we could do, because we were so new, whether or not we could do a full-length story. So I sent them Scarlet and Gaslight's first issue. Basically, it hadn't been published, but I had the art and everything finished. And so I went ahead and sent them that. It was about 30 pages. And then surprised that they went for both. So that's kind of what happened there. And I mean, I'm sure I'm forgetting some things or another, but it seems to me that most everything else, particularly the stuff that folks tend to remember and that I get asked to sign the most when I'm doing a show or something, it seems like to me those, for some odd reason, came to me. Like I had wanted to do a Popeye story forever, and my friend Terry Beatty and I, he was one of the Batman artists, he loved Popeye too. And every time we'd get together at a convention, we were always like, yeah, one day we're going to do a Popeye story. But Popeye was, is owned by the King Feature Syndicate. And I understand the license is very expensive, which is strange to me because, I mean, why is it
not
so
the
expensive?
hottest character of the decade?
No, and he should be. I think he should be still, but they're not making him very available. Anyway, a publisher called IDW, they obtained a license to do new Popeye material, and they were also reprinting some of the great old stuff. And I had let it be known, because I was working with them on a different project, that I was interested in Popeye, and I think I said it maybe once on the phone. And then suddenly the editor calls me up one day and he says, "You still want to do a Popeye story?" And I said, "Of course." He said, "Well, don't answer so amiably at first, because every other writer I've mentioned this to has turned it down." I said, "Oh, so I wasn't your first choice." And he's like, he said, no. He said, "Seriously," he goes, "there's been about 5 or 6, and they all laughed at me and hung up on me."
Whoa.
And I said, "Well, what is it?" And he said, "Well, we've got the the license too for Mars Attacks. So what we're going to do is we're going to take every comic book character that we publish, and we're going to take a special make a special issue of, like they published the Kiss comic book, for example, the rock band.
Sure.
And so they were going to do a Mars Attacks Kiss, and they did. And but the first one they wanted to do was Mars Attacks Popeye.
Oh no.
And he said that to me. And I don't exactly remember my initial reaction other than I just heard Popeye, you know. And I said, it sounds great. I love it. And he said, really? And he seemed, because I could tell he thought it was a dumb idea. And so I said, yeah. I said, yeah, I would like to do it. He said, well, we're in kind of a time crunch here, which they always are. And he said, so can you get me something like within a couple days, a week, something like that? And I said, sure. I'll see what I can do. So I walked around the block, and by the time I came around, I had the whole story. And it was the easiest thing I've ever written by far.
Fascinating.
And I don't know where it came from.
Can you give us the gist? Because I'm not even sure where I would start with the Martians and Popeye.
I'm going to jostle around a little bit here because I need to plug in my charger.
Oh, good.
Okay. I was determined that I wanted to keep this as close to the original Popeyes as I could. And by that I mean the comic.
The 1930s iconic Popeye.
Right. So sorry, hold on.
Yep.
Sorry about that.
No problem.
I had enough power at first, so I don't know. It's all drained away. What's going on, Peter? I was in a haunted house one time that happened to my phone. I had a supposed haunted house. I was in there and I was taking pictures of this one bedroom, looking at the bar on my phone, and it just went like that. So anyway, so I decided that, I wanted to make it as true to the authentic 1920s, 1930s Popeye as I possibly could.
Okay.
And so by that I mean, whoops, it looks like this is still not plugged in. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry.
Yep. I'm imagining, again, Popeye has continued on. There was it the 70s or the 80s that the Robin Williams film was shot in Malta, which was very clever and very weird.
It was 1980, I think. Okay. And it's not a very popular movie, but I thought it was great. I mean, to me, is bringing Popeye to life, and I thought it was great. But there was there were some of the original Popeye stories that E.C. Sager, who created him, wrote in the original strips that did involve things like Martians. They weren't these Martians, but they were Martians.
Well,
they were identified as being Martians.
So Popeye had some experience. Okay.
Yeah, when I found that out, I guess I got over my stage fright and thought, well, I'm doing, I'm not doing some bastardized version. I mean, this could be the real thing. And so I went ahead and wrote it up that way. But it was something that I wrote, I think, just in a couple of days. One of the fastest things I've ever done. And I sent it off to my editor, who was a different editor than the guy who pitched this at me. And the only thing she changed was she said, where's the spinach? And I said, well, in the original Popeye comic strips, spinach doesn't come up very often. I mean, it's in every cartoon, every animated cartoon, but in the actual comic strips, I think it's only a couple times it actually shows him actually really gorging himself on spinach to make himself more powerful, because he's always really, really strong.
But he could open that can of spinach just by squeezing it. He didn't need a can opener or anything like that. Oh yeah.
So she said, well, King Features wants spinach. So So there's a big scene in it where the Martians are inside this giant robot, kind of fighting everybody, and it's Popeye and Poop Deck Pappy, his dad, and the goons, and all of that going on, and Jeep that are fighting the Martians.
Oh yeah.
So what I did was I rewrote a little bit of it where it shows Popeye taking the spinach with Pappy, and Popeye gets his clothes torn off, and he's wearing boxer shorts with spinach cans printed on it.
Of course.
And because I really didn't want to rewrite the whole thing, So I thought, well, if I'm advertising spinach that way, is that enough? And apparently it was, because they went.
I have to ask you, as part of the way that you run your Facebook page, and I think for you, possibly like me at times, it's just this cheerful, brief escape from whatever the hell you're doing. Oh, I think I'll post this. Or you do something that I find very moving and often very informative, which is remembering the birthdays and the days of passings of primarily famous actors, all writers and people in popular culture, but often they're ones who I admire a lot. And, it's a time to just take a moment and remember these performers, these people who train to create characters, working, of course, in tandem with great writers and producers and directors and studio systems very often. And we often find out, after the fact, that they were less than laudatory people in their private lives, or extremely decent people, often above and beyond. In art school, it was a never-ending debate of, I don't like the way Picasso treated women, so I reject his art, which has now become even more ferocious, politically correct in terms of dialogue. But at a certain point, giving up on it. Life is complex, so is art, so are artists. And you look at the UK writer who married Patricia Neal. Why am I blanking? A very great author of children's books as well as adult books. And Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, James and the Giant Peach. He's a miserable human being and not a very good husband, but he was a wonderful writer. And do you remember at a certain point in kind of creating this catalog of people in your head, in your reality, as your film viewing grew more sophisticated, of actors who, once again, curiosity informed by creativity. I am really curious to know more about this actor, this person with this memorable face who played all these parts, some of which really moved me. They live with me as a regular part of my life. Part of the quality of my life has been determined by great performances, sometimes all by myself, sitting in the dark watching a movie, and the more for it. It's so much a part of our lives that most of us don't even think of it. But the world of great actors and acting and writers coming together, you can be alone and never lonely if you've tapped into this world. Do you do that as just sort of a way of honoring these people throughout the year, or are you working from kind of a yearly calendar that you check anyway because you're curious about what happened on this day? It's just a behavior of yours that I always enjoy seeing reflected on your pages, those times that you do it, which very regularly. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I appreciate what you're saying there in regards to that. It's something that I do mostly, I guess, just for myself. At least that's how it started out. I decided early on in Facebook right when I first joined, which I jumped from MySpace. Remember that?
Vaguely.
Everybody was telling me, Facebook's where you got to go, and then whatever. And so finally, eventually, I bit the bullet. But I looked around at different people's pages and so forth, and I thought, well, these are all kind of miserable and kind of hateful. And even among people that I admired and genuinely like, there seemed to be a sorrow amongst a lot of it too that was really depressing. And I'm not saying that they shouldn't do that. Do anything you want. It's your Facebook page.
Yes.
But I wanted to make mine to be a place where you could go to get away from that. And especially a family friendly place, because I have so many. I mean, I've written over 30 kids books, and so I have a lot of kid readers that message me and so on and so forth. It's really nice.
Wow.
And I don't want them to see a lot of profanity or anything like that.
Sure.
Anything too horrible. So I always insist on that. But I think that the reason why I try to honor these people, writers, artists, actors,
yes,
what have you, is because I know in my lesser way what a bit of what I think they went through for their art. It's not easy. I mean, this hasn't been an easy time for me. It's always been an interesting time, but I don't think there's a published writer around that would say that it's been easy for them.
No.
Harlan Ellison used to have a thing that he would say that I think is very, very true. He said, becoming a writer is the easy part. Staying a writer is the hard part.
Yeah, you got to keep writing.
Yeah, so that's the thing. And so I know that they put their heart and their soul in a lot of this stuff, and they should be remembered for it.
Yeah.
And also, I like the idea that they would never could imagine in the 21st century that somebody would be writing about them, wishing them a happy birthday after they've been dead for 50 years. And there's just something about that I like. It makes me feel like I know them better.
Yeah.
And I've always kind of leaned toward the underdog as well. I mean, I can remember when I first started finding out more about Edgar Allan Poe and learning what his life was like. And a lot of what people think his life was like is not true.
Yes.
A lot of that is misinformation, and they don't understand what Poe went through. Yeah. He's a very sympathetic character. I mean, I'm sure he was a difficult man, but look at what he did. I mean, I'm not the only one who probably thinks that. I think he was probably the greatest American writer ever. And when you consider that all of his work could be contained in a volume about this thick, that's amazing. Look what impact he had
over a relatively short period of time.
Yeah, I think he died when he was 40, I believe. So he made a big impression on me. I remember my introduction of Edgar Allan Poe. I was in, I think, 3rd or 4th grade. My brother Rick came home from high school, knocked on my door.
Telltale Heart?
Yes. And he came in and he said, I want to read you this story.
Oh, wow, that's great.
He sat down on my bed and I listened to it. And it's a fairly short story. I think it's less than probably 10 pages or so.
So evocative.
But I was just floored. I was like, what? But so he cut him up and put him under the floorboards, and Rick just would look at me, just knowingly nod.
And if you listen closely,
he says, this guy wrote a whole lot of stuff just like this. So next time you're at the library, look up Edgar Allan Poe. And I did. And I was, like I said, 3rd or 4th grade.
That's great.
But my little Catholic school library had Tales of Mystery and Imagination. And I took it home. And I think the first one I read was The Telltale Heart again. And then I read Pit and the Pendulum and The Cast of Amontillado and The Black Cat. And I was hooked, from then on.
Yeah.
And I think he was one of the first writers too that gave me a sense of language, the music and the rhythm in his language that Poe was very distinctive of. So
he really he's so ubiquitous in our culture that very few people have taken the time to, it's not a huge anthology of work, but they're fine with, spin-offs or films or a caricature or a photograph, but like you say, and again, this is one of the great things about becoming involved in something that has its own drive mechanism attached. If you are involved in a subject that truly compels you to want to learn more about it, you're in one of the most ideal situations a person can be in terms of creative satisfaction and moving forward in your own work, your own imagine, your own life. And this kind of dovetails into a related subject. And when I began the show talking about, and now we're back, the idea of people who not only love reading, but love books and have an intention in life to build a library. There is that sense that some of us have from childhood of being natural archivists. We collect stuff. And it's, there's a zillion different things to collect, of course. It's for most people where, a factor is finances, a rock, the odd book, a shell, feathers. You can start out fairly substantially in the natural world. And, fossils, I have a number of them in my house, which I absolutely love. But then there's the ephemera and the paperwork and material that's generated as you are becoming yourself and realizing that history is spinning around you, whether it's popular culture or political history. And, here's a campaign button. Here's this old letter that I got at this swap meet. I'm starting to collect this kind of this book. And the next thing you know, you're, fairly busy character looking for things. Now, I think it's fair to say that you are not just a collector. You are a collector at this point in your life of collections of a certain genre, material, and things. And it's part of the fun of being your friend online to see photographs that show other things in the background. It's like, oh, I want to get into that room right now with the Karloff corner that you're occupying. Where, as a kid, do you remember a certain point where you realize that I'm collecting stuff? I've got, this. I've got another one of these guys. I've got, some issues of Mad Magazine. I've got, this little model of a scary creature. I'm on my way.
Right. It all kind of goes back to the same kind of
Dinosaurs.
thing. When I was, I think 6, it all kind of starts around 5, 6, and 7, all in there. And for Christmas one year, I got the Wolfman Aurora model kit.
Nice.
And my mom had a cousin of mine assemble it and paint it for me, so it looked really cool.
Whoa.
And I know that I had some months before had seen Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, and I must not have shut up about the Wolfman because
Give the kid the Wolfman.
Because I didn't know this model kit existed.
Oh.
And there it was. And not only that, she got me the Wolfman mystery game, which today goes for like thousands and thousands of dollars. And then I don't know if you could see him back here. There's a Frankenstein model back here, Big Frankie. He's kind of in the corner. That was that same Christmas I got him. So model kits were probably my first kind of serious, because I thought, you mean there's more of them? There's like Dracula and the Creature from the Black Lagoon and Bride of Frankenstein and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and so on and so on. And I had them all eventually.
After gluing them together, then you got to paint them. And if you had a steady hand, you had something to be proud of.
So it was that was what really started me on it. I think, and just in terms of just collecting. I eventually had them all, but in those days, the model kits only cost about, I think, between 99 cents and about $1.49. The big ones like King Kong and Godzilla were $1.49. and which seems ridiculously small today, but at the same time, I mean, I got a quarter a week allowance, so it gives you an idea of how
Exactly.
yeah of
This
how
was real money.
how extravagant I thought they were, because to get four of them was a whole month's,
That's
or
an
get one of them
investment.
rather was a whole month's salary for me, or 4 months or so. I remember finally getting the rest of them and just kind of thinking, well, now what?
What's
And
my new frontier?
then a few years passed, and then they started doing dinosaur models, and so I started getting them.
Ah,
And I thought, oh wait, and I remember thinking, which ones are they doing? And I found found it something in a magazine about them. I thought, oh, there's a whole lot of them. Great, because we always want there to be more.
now,
That's one of the sad things about L. Frank Baum's Oz books. That so many people love the movie, of course, and are familiar with the first book, but a lot of people don't know it's part of a series.
yeah,
And he wrote 14 Oz books, and
yes.
Wizard of Oz, as great as it is not the best one. So I always am trying to tell people who are getting kids to that age where they could handle something like that, that always recommend them, and they're starting to come back in print again, so they're not so hard to find anymore.
And
Um,
do I remember correctly, Martin, from your bookshelves, do you have the full run of the original first edition of the Oz books?
I don't have all first editions.
But yeah,
I have a
the
few
first
that are.
edition, whatever printing.
Yeah, I have a few that are first editions, but most of them are early editions.
Yeah,
Some of them, let's see, one, two. I'm looking at them right now. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of them were library copies,
sure.
and which
Amazing
cost
the
me.
things that libraries sold off at different
Yeah,
points, and I'm familiar with it in UFO
they're in
books at a
great
certain point.
they're in great shape, and they cost me practically nothing.
And they are
So
a very iconic look. For anybody that's never seen the original Oz books, I think they're now available, some of them in facsimile, but it's an illustrating style that you can't confuse with anything else. They're sensational.
yes,
Um, I'm not asking for an exact number here, because when we collect, it's out of love, and things just kind of just more of them appear. It's like the law of attraction or something. At first, you're really looking hard, and then they're coming to you. Can you give us an estimate of how many various types of dinosaur figures you have in your home at present, give or take?
1, 2, 3, 4. Well, just on these shelves that are over in this way, there's about 60.
Mm. And there are other
And
rooms with dinosaurs looking in them as well.
yes, and then straight across from me is my King Kong collection,
Ah,
and 2 of those shelves are dinosaurs, and there's about 60. And then I've got some over here, and then in our library room is probably where most of the dinosaurs are, as well as my Godzilla collection, which is huge.
whoa.
Yeah.
I imagine sometimes, and we have good imaginations, that at night they all come alive. And it's like this
I hope not.
ultimate. Well, if it's happening, they're behaving themselves. There's no carnage left in the morning. Um, they get along. Is there any kind of uh, area of collecting that kind of caught you off guard in terms of, I didn't intend to collect those things, or this kind of paperwork or ephemera, or these kind of figures, or this thing having to do with making films? Is there anything that kind of you hadn't expected that you would ultimately be collecting that you collect? And we will do a future show where we will get to take a walk through with you and meet the thousands of creatures that live with you and Leia and your actual live dogs.
um, yeah, I mean, I think that's part of the real joy of collecting, is that when one thing leads and spills into another that you didn't expect, that you would be interested in.
Yes.
Like for example, these monster models, monster masks rather, behind me,
Yeah.
were something I wanted as a kid, but they were way too expensive. for kids. I think they were like $35 or something. They may as well have been 3,500, And but now they've been reissued again, especially these two Frankenstein masks, and they're about the same price that they were then.
Oh,
Roughly,
wonderful.
So I didn't expect ever to get them, and there they are, along with the creature, which you can't really see because of my big old head.
Martin, let's talk King Kong for a while. Again, a fictional character, unique in terms of Western popular culture, and let's not even, Mighty Joe Young from 1949, a noble, sad effort. Footnote to the Kong himself, the story so wonderfully captured in the original black and white movie, which for me is the stuff that dreams are made of, especially, and it's not gender related, but for little boys, me and a lot of my friends growing up, the idea of the island and the natives and everything being animated by the imagination and the skills of a man named Ray Harryhausen, who, no, it wasn't. It was
Willis O'Brien.
Bingo.
Yeah,
That
Harryhausen did work on Mighty Joe Young.
That the original King Kong figure is like 18 inches tall.
Yeah.
And when we look at it on film, and if you're lucky, you've seen a restored print of it, which is terribly exciting. I got to see one locally with the Cornell Film Society here in Ithaca some years ago. The biggest surprise for me was that faery in her nightgown was more revealing than any of us had imagined, with the augmentation of the clarity of the film. But this is the stuff, I don't know, the idea of romance, and the guy gets the girl. And, as faery was fond of saying in later years, every time I go by the Empire State Building, I stop and have a moment of silence because somebody I know, I loved, died there. And how the film itself became its own kind of culture. The second version of the film, the one that was Dino De Laurentiis version, shot at the World Trade Center, was one of the biggest barking dogs of all time. It was not a very effective film to watch. Although one of my dearest friends, who will be a guest on the show in a few weeks, Albert Bouchard, got to be one of the extras standing around the body at the bottom. And Jessica Lange, it's true, she got her introduction in that film. But then came Peter Jackson. And as a New Yorker, and as somebody with an appreciation for Depression history and tales of daring do, and just he is one of our finest filmmakers, that version struck chords that resonated with the original, just filling it out a bit. And those scenes in New York City that beforehand, and then the contact with the Beauty and the Beast. Do you remember the first time you watched King Kong?
I do. King Kong may have started the whole thing, actually, because I know it was before I ever started school. So I was, 4 or 5, I guess. But I do remember it. I was outside in the backyard playing in the sandbox. And my mom came out and said,
I want to scare the shit out of you. Come on in.
She said for me to come in the house because there was a movie on TV about a giant. This is the way she said. She had a very pronounced Tennessee accent, and she said it's got a giant griller in it. And I had to kind of pause a moment to kind of translate that in my head. And I thought, a giant gorilla, and I knew what gorillas were already, and so I thought, and I loved them, so I thought, oh, really, a giant gorilla? What? How'd they do that? So I came in, and it was probably about 40 minutes in, I think. So I'd missed a good chunk. But the good parts were really getting started. You know what I mean? And I found that out later when I got to see the full movie.
By the way, in some parts of the country, griller is a term used for hot dog, but keep going.
Wow. Okay. Live and learn. So yeah, so I saw Kong for the first time. Had no idea how it was done. Knew there was no such thing as a giant gorilla. So it must be
Could
some
enjoy it.
kind of trick.
Yeah.
And in fact, that was my introduction to dinosaurs too. And I just thought they
right.
were made up animals, just like King Kong. It wasn't until I went to the school library with my brothers a little while after
These are
that I
real.
found out dinosaurs were real, and
Not
that
like
blew my
giant
mind.
gorillas.
Yeah, and there was something kind of like Kong too, actually, that actually lived. Not quite as big as Kong, of course, but still an ape that stood about 10 feet tall. So uh, Gigantopithecus.
Wow.
But yeah, I remember King Kong very well. Uh, it's probably my all-time favorite movie, the original. I like the Peter Jackson version too. But it's probably my favorite for a number of reasons. Just the nostalgic and the sentimental aspects to it for me,
Yeah.
and plus to me, there's just the subject matter and how it's created is what film to me is all about.
Yeah.
It's creating its own world that
Yes.
doesn't exist, but you believe it. I mean, King Kong, like you said, was an 18-inch tall steel armature covered with rabbit fur and latex, and we cry when he dies.
Yeah.
It's a puppet basically, and he brings emotion out in us because it's animated so beautifully. One of the things too that I remember recognizing as a kid that I think is really powerful about the original Kong,
Yes.
and the original one's the only one that's done it quite like this, is that there's no one in the movie, not even Ann Darrow, realizes that Kong is the hero. But we as the audience do, and I think that made me feel kind of special in a way that I recognized that this was the hero of the story right
Yeah.
here. That he wasn't, really wanting to hurt anybody necessarily, unless they were coming after him, which he did.
The whole
So
thing of being captured and subdued and taken out of its natural habitat as a curiosity, as a freak, that got to me as a kid. There was something wrong with that. The whole idea of the base, legendary character Frank Buck, bring him back alive, the famous
Right.
animal
Right.
procurer for circuses and the like. As a New Yorker, even and especially as a little boy, very familiar with the Empire State Building. One of the big take homes for me was this film was made so long ago that the television tower on top of the Empire State Building, which I grew up with, wasn't there. It's just that rounded top, which, as any terribly curious person who knows a great deal about a few things and a little bit about many things, knows that it was designed, there was no way it was going to happen, but it was designed as a mooring point for blimps.
Dirigibles. Yep.
City of the future, come floating in over Manhattan, hook up, get on the stairway, walk down, and get out of the Empire State Building, and you're in New York.
Wow.
They tried it once with a Navy blimp, and it almost.
I didn't know they tried it. I didn't know they
did.
actually tried it.
And it was almost a complete human disaster. Luckily, the blimp was able to get away, but it was impossible to maneuver. And I have been up in that very top rounded area. It's like being in a World War I submarine or something. And the idea of there was nothing for him to grab onto. It was just, harder to. And thinking about the drops, I had been up in the Empire State Building as a kid. It was very visceral. And then, of course, like kids, especially little boys who are somewhat ghoulish, of when he fell, there had to be a big mess. And I want to see some reference to the cleanup. And, all the blood on the streets and things. Unfortunately, the movie didn't give us any of that. But a fable, for a time still, in a way. Martin, is there a central website or place that we can go to learn about your many books? About how many books with your imprint, with you as author, are out there right now across the board, children's and adults?
Yeah, I don't know. I've never really counted them. Um, it's not everything is still in print, but if you were to count everything together, it's probably a couple hundred books. The best place to find any of my stuff is I do have an author's Amazon page. And just type in Martin Powell, and it doesn't show everything I've done, but it shows most of what's in print right now. I think most all of my kids' books are there, but a few others too, and so forth. But yeah. And then, of course, on Facebook, I never found that a website would really have much, sway with me, really, in a lot of ways. So I never did attempt it. Seemed to have done okay without it. So
that's great. Is there any advice you'd give to younger listeners and viewers who might be interested in pursuing a career as a writer, but a genre writer, and have a chance at maybe breaking into some of the areas that you have? Because you must have a really serious work ethic. Nobody can produce the amount of material, and it's not just writing it for yourself. It's out there in the world. It's published. It's represented. Any advice to young writers?
And you have to please editors too.
I mean, with the Harlan Ellison mantra in place, then you've got to keep writing.
Right. I don't know. I think that the best advice I could ever give is just that, like where I'm concerned, I treat it like a regular job. And I've had lots of different jobs over the years, of course, before I started doing this full time when I was in my late 20s. But so I get up in the morning like everybody else does, and I mean, I know some writers that write all night and things like that, and I used to kind of do that too when I had to do it.
Sure.
And it's nice and romantic in a way. You feel like you're the lone writer up and burning the candle and all this, and that's nice. But I think I do better work in the daytime. Ray always told me that he got up in the morning, every morning, and just went straight to his typewriter and wrote a sentence. And then he went and had breakfast and looked at his mail and all this stuff. Then came back and then finished the story before noon. Wow. So I don't do that.
Whatever works. It's different for everyone.
Yeah, it's different. Whatever works for you. He never had a plan in mind, he told me, when he started to write. He just wrote. And Stephen King writes like that too. I don't get it myself. I write toward a conclusion that I've already conceived. That's the best way for me to cause some misdirection and a few surprises, is to already know how it's going to end up. So
is there anything that is about to be published or available to watch that we should be watching for or looking toward reading, about to come out of the Powell factory?
Well, the newest thing that I have out, which has only been about a month or so, is a graphic novel about Calvin Parker's
UFO abduction,
UFO experience. It was something that took me about a year and a half to do, because I was really overswamped with work, and sure. I couldn't turn it down.
Yeah.
And so what I basically did is I write 7 days a week usually, and I took half of a Sunday for like about a year and so, or in a few months, to write it, based on Calvin's book. And so that came out about a month ago or so, and it's gotten good reviews, and I enjoyed working on it. I enjoyed getting to know Calvin, who passed away shortly ago,
a couple months ago.
And so it was a great thing. I've been interested in UFO phenomenon for a really long time.
And that is something we're going to have to hold for our next show. I can hardly believe it, but we have had our own missing time experience. Martin Powell, it is a pleasure to finally connect with you here. And I hope that we will have a time in the next few months or something when you can return, or when the weather is starting to warm up, and you can take us on a tour and we can actually talk UFOs. This is Peter Robbins. The show has been Meanwhile Here on Earth. My guest has been Martin Powell. Join us again next week. And Martin, again, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thanks for asking me. I appreciate it.